The blood was the first thing, a smear of impossible crimson against the endless, blinding white of the snow. Alara saw it from the single, grimy window of her cabin, a jagged wound in the otherwise perfect blanket of the blizzard's first assault. Her breath fogged the glass, a small, fleeting cloud of warmth in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. For a moment, she thought it was an animal, a deer wounded by a wolf, a common enough tragedy in the high, unforgiving teeth of the Whisperwind Mountains. But the shape, a dark mound almost entirely swallowed by the accumulating drifts, was too large. It was the wrong kind of still. It was the stillness of something that had given up. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, the course while doing little to ward off the chill that had less to do with the storm and more to do with the gnawing emptiness in her belly and the ice that had permanently settled around her heart. Her husband, Liam, had been gone 6 months. His body found at the bottom of the old quarry, a place he had no reason to be. The townsfolk in Havens Creek, and then in the 2 towns downriver, had called it an accident. But they had whispered another word, too. A word that clung to her like the mountain cold. Cursed. They said the mountain had claimed him, the same way it had claimed her parents in an avalanche years before. They said she was a magnet for misfortune, a black-hearted widow who brought ruin to any man fool enough to get close. Her gaze drifted to the corner of the one-room cabin, where her 5-year-old son, Finn, slept fitfully beneath a pile of patched-up quilts. His face, pale and thin, was a constant, aching reminder of her failure. They were almost out of food. The last of the salted pork was gone. The flour sack was little more than dust, and her snares in the woods had come up empty for a week. The isolation, once a comfort shared with Liam, had become a prison. Silas Croft, the man who owned the bank, the general store, and nearly every soul in Havens Creek, had made sure of that. He had bought Liam's debt, a phantom figure on a ledger that grew with each passing day. He wanted the land, the last piece of the high ridge he didn't own. And he wanted her. His offers, delivered by his sneering henchmen, had started as cloying proposals of marriage and had curdled into thinly veiled threats. Her curse was a convenient tool, a lie he had nurtured until it took root in the superstitious hearts of the valley folk, ensuring no one would help her, no one would trade with her, no one would even meet her gaze. The wind shrieked, a chorus of tortured souls clawing at the log walls of the cabin. It was a sound that promised to bury the world. The dark shape in the snow had not moved. It was a human being. She knew it with a certainty that made her stomach clench. Leaving them out, there was a death sentence. But bringing them in, who knew what kind of danger that invited? It could be one of Croft's men, sent to scare her. It could be a bandit, a mad trapper. But as another gust of wind tore a sheet of white from the mound, she saw the glint of a worn leather satchel, half buried. Not the kind of thing one of Croft's thugs would carry. It spoke of a traveler, someone caught unaware by the storm's sudden, savage fury. She looked at Finn again, his small chest rising and falling in a fragile rhythm. What kind of woman would she be if she let a person die on her doorstep while her own child slept, warm and safe, just a few feet away? Cursed or not, she was still human. Her heart, though bruised and battered, still beat. With a sigh that seemed to drain the last of her resolve, she pulled on Liam's old bearskin coat, the weight of it a familiar, painful comfort. She grabbed the rusty iron poker from the hearth, its heft a pathetic reassurance. Then, taking a deep breath of the smoky air, she unlatched the heavy wooden door and stepped out into the screaming, white hell of the blizzard. The cold was a physical blow. It stole the air from her lungs and drove needles of ice into her exposed cheeks. The wind tore at her, a living entity that sought to rip the coat from her back and fling her into the abyss of the canyon below. Snow, as fine and sharp as sand, blasted her face, blinding her. She lowered her head, using the poker to probe the ground in front of her, and fought her way toward the dark shape. Each step was a monumental effort, her boots sinking deep into the rapidly deepening snow. The world was a swirling vortex of white and gray, the cabin disappearing behind her after only a dozen paces. She was alone, adrift in the storm's heart. When she finally reached the mound, she saw that her instinct had been right. It was a man, and he was massive. He lay face down, a giant of a figure clad in thick furs and worn leather, a long rifle strapped to his back. A dark, ugly stain was spreading from his side, melting the snow beneath him into a slushy, pinkish mire. The blood she had seen from the window. He was wounded. Badly. She knelt, the wind trying to shove her over, and grabbed his shoulder. "Mister? Can you hear me?" she shouted, her voice immediately snatched away by the gale. There was no response. His skin, where she touched his neck to feel for a pulse, was dangerously cold, but there was a faint, thready beat beneath her numb fingers. He was alive. Just. She tried to roll him over, her muscles straining against his dead weight. He was built like a grizzly, a solid wall of muscle and bone that seemed anchored to the frozen earth. Grunting with effort, she finally managed to heave him onto his side. His face was a landscape of harsh lines and old scars, partially obscured by a thick, dark beard frosted with ice. A long, jagged scar cut down from his left temple, disappearing into his beard. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and ragged. He looked less like a man from the civilized valley and more like something born of the mountains themselves, wild, untamed, and dangerous even in unconsciousness. Panic fluttered in her chest, a frantic bird beating against her ribs. This was madness. He was too big. She could never move him. The storm was getting worse, the snow already piling up around them, threatening to form a premature grave. She should go back to the cabin, bar the door, and pray the storm passed. It was what a sensible person would do. It was what a person who wasn't cursed would do. But then her eyes fell on the dark stain at his side again. He had been shot. Someone had tried to kill him. He wasn't a predator. He was prey, just like her. A different kind of prey, perhaps, but hunted all the same. A stubborn, defiant anger rose up through the fear. It was the same anger that made her refuse Croft's advances, the same anger that kept her searching for firewood in the biting cold when her hands were raw and bleeding. She would not let the mountain, or the storm, or some distant man with a gun claim another life on her land. Not today. She wedged her shoulder under his arm, wrapping his heavy limb around her neck. "Come on," she grunted, her voice a raw whisper against the wind's roar. "You are not dying here." She planted her feet, bent her knees, and pulled. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. He was an anchor, a deadweight. Then, with a groan that was torn from the very depths of her soul, she surged upward. He shifted, a half-slide, half-drag through the snow. It was the beginning of the most arduous journey of her life. 100 feet that felt like 100 miles. She dragged him, inch by tortuous inch, back toward the faint, flickering promise of her cabin window. She fell a dozen times, her face plunging into the freezing snow, the man's weight crushing the air from her lungs. Each time, she spat out the snow, wiped her eyes, and got up again. His blood left a grim, smeared trail behind them, a path that the storm was already greedily erasing. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned, and the world narrowed to the next step and the next. He was a mountain she was moving, a dead weight of sinew and bone that smelled of pine, wet leather, and blood. When she finally stumbled against the solid wood of her own door, she collapsed, her body trembling with exhaustion. She fumbled with the latch, her fingers clumsy and frozen, and somehow managed to swing the door inward. With one last, desperate heave, she pulled the man's massive frame over the threshold. He landed with a heavy thud on the rough-hewn floorboards, a broken giant brought in from the cold. She slammed the door shut against the howling wind, dropping the thick wooden bar into place. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the crackle of the fire and her own ragged, desperate gasps for air. She leaned against the door, her body screaming in protest, and slid to the floor. Outside, the blizzard raged, trying to tear the world apart. Inside, in the small, flickering circle of firelight, she was trapped with a wounded, dangerous stranger and the terrifying, uncertain consequences of her own mercy. For a long time, Alara just sat there, her back pressed against the door, listening to the storm and the stranger's labored breathing. The initial rush of adrenaline faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a tremor in her hands she couldn't control. The man lay unmoving on the floor, a dark, sprawling presence that seemed to shrink the already small cabin. He was a disruption, a piece of the violent outside world that had breached her fragile sanctuary. His sheer size was intimidating. He was taller than Liam had been and broader across the shoulders. Even lying wounded and unconscious, he radiated a sense of dormant power, like a slumbering bear that could wake at any moment in a fury of claws and teeth. Finn stirred in his sleep, murmuring a soft, incoherent word. The sound jolted Alara from her stupor. She had a child to think of. She couldn't just leave this man bleeding on her floor. Cursing her own softness, she pushed herself to her feet, her legs protesting with a fiery ache. She lit another tallow lamp, the small flame pushing back the shadows and casting a wavering golden light over the man's face. Up close, he was even more rugged. His beard was unkempt, threaded with gray at the temples, and his skin was weathered and tanned by years of sun and wind. The scar by his eye was old, white and puckered, a testament to some past violence. More recent were the dark bruises blooming on his cheekbone and a split lip, crusted with dried blood. He had been in a fight before he was shot. She knew she had to tend to the wound. Leaving it would mean he'd die of fever or infection, and all her effort to drag him inside would have been for nothing. Taking a deep, fortifying breath, she knelt beside him. First, she had to get his heavy, wet outer layers off. Unbuckling the straps of his fur-lined coat was a struggle. Her fingers were still half-frozen and clumsy, and the leather was stiff with ice. When she finally pulled it open, she saw the source of the bleeding. The bullet had torn through the thick wool shirt on his left side, just above his hip, shredding the fabric and matting it with blood. It looked high enough to have missed anything vital, but it was impossible to know for sure. Working with a grim, detached efficiency she hadn't known she possessed, she took Liam's old hunting knife, the one he'd kept sharp enough to skin a buck, and carefully cut away the blood-soaked cloth. The skin beneath was a mangled mess of torn flesh and dark, congealing blood. The wound was ugly, a ragged puncture that was still oozing sluggishly. There was no exit wound on his back, which meant the bullet was still inside him. Her stomach turned, but she swallowed the bile that rose in her throat. She had seen worse, helping her mother tend to logging accidents when she was a girl. She moved to the hearth, placing a small pot of water from their precious barrel over the fire to heat. From a small wooden chest beneath her bed, she retrieved her mother's healing supplies. A linen-wrapped bundle of dried yarrow and willow bark, a small bottle of potent, moonshine-like spirits for cleaning, and clean strips of old linen for bandages. Her mother had been the valley's unofficial healer, a woman who understood the language of herbs and roots. The same people who now called Alara cursed had once lined up at her door, seeking remedies and comfort. The irony was a bitter pill. While the water heated, she unstrapped the man's rifle and set it carefully against the wall, far from the hearth. It was a heavy, well-cared-for weapon, its wooden stock worn smooth with use. His knife, sheathed in a leather scabbard on his belt, was equally practical and deadly-looking. He was a man who lived by these tools. She also found his satchel. Her hands hesitated over the buckle. It felt like a violation to go through his things, but she needed to know who he was. Was he a lawman? An outlaw? Just a trapper caught in the wrong place? Her curiosity and her fear won out. She opened it. Inside, there was no identification, no letters, nothing to give him a name. There were only the practical, Spartan possessions of a man who lived a solitary life. A whetstone, a tinderbox, a small pouch of salt, several coils of expertly made snare wire, and a block of hardtack. Tucked in a side pocket was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, worn smooth as if from years of being handled. The sight of it gave her a strange pang. It was a small, humanizing detail in an otherwise intimidating picture. This giant of a man carried a small, fragile carving. When the water was hot, she poured it into a bowl, adding a handful of the crushed yarrow to help stop the bleeding. The sharp, clean scent of the herb filled the small cabin. She took the bowl, the spirits, and the bandages back to the stranger's side. Gently, she began to clean the wound. He flinched at her touch, a low groan rumbling in his chest, but he didn't wake. His skin was fever-hot now, a dangerous warmth spreading from the injury. She worked meticulously, her hands steady despite the tremor she still felt deep inside. She cleaned away the blood, her fingers probing the edges of the wound. She could feel it then, a small, hard lump lodged deep in the muscle. The bullet. Her mother had taught her how to do this, too, on a farmhand who'd had a mishap with an old pistol. The memory came back with startling clarity. Her mother's calm voice, her steady hands. You have to be quick, and you have to be clean. And you can't be afraid to cause a little more pain to stop a lot more later. Alara sterilized the tip of Liam's skinning knife in the flames of the lamp until it glowed orange. She took a breath, whispered an apology to the unconscious man, and made a small, precise incision over the lump. He arched his back with a guttural cry of pain, his eyes flying open for a brief, unfocused second before rolling back into his head. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't stop. Using the knife tip and her fingers, she worked the lead slug free. It came out with a sickening squelch, and she dropped the misshapen piece of metal into the bowl with a clatter. Fresh blood welled up, but it was clean blood. She quickly poured a little of the raw spirits into the wound. The man convulsed, his whole body going rigid, a strangled sound tearing from his throat. It was a brutal, necessary act of violence to prevent a greater one. After the initial agony, his body went limp again. She packed the cleaned wound with more yarrow paste, and then wrapped his torso tightly with the linen strips, creating a thick, absorbent bandage. His breathing was still ragged, but it seemed a fraction less shallow. She slumped back on her heels, the knife falling from her trembling hand. The floorboards around her were stained with his blood and the water from the bowl. She felt drained, hollowed out. She had just cut into a man she didn't know, a potentially dangerous man, and he was still here, in her home, with her child. She looked at his face again. In the flickering light, with the pain momentarily eased, some of the harshness seemed to have softened. He just looked like a man, lost and hurt. Wearily, she cleaned up the mess as best she could. She couldn't leave him on the cold floor. With another monumental effort, she managed to drag him closer to the fire, resting his head on a rolled-up blanket. She covered him with another quilt, tucking it around his broad shoulders. Then, she retreated to the far side of the cabin, huddling in the rocking chair Liam had made her, the iron poker back in her lap. She watched him, listening to the twin sounds of the blizzard's fury and the stranger's breathing. She had saved his life, for now. But she couldn't shake the feeling that by bringing him inside, she had irrevocably altered the course of her own. The storm had trapped them together, a cursed widow and a wounded giant, and now all she could do was wait for the morning and for him to wake up. The stranger drifted in and out of consciousness for 2 days. The blizzard never relented, entombing the small cabin in a world of white. The wind howled and moaned, a constant, mournful presence that scraped at the edges of Alara's sanity. Snow piled up against the door and crept in thick drifts halfway up the window, plunging the cabin into a perpetual twilight. The only light came from the fire, which Alara kept blazing, feeding it from their dwindling woodpile with a growing sense of anxiety. During his lucid moments, the man was delirious with fever. He thrashed against the quilts, his powerful body moving with a restless energy that frightened her. He spoke in a low, gravelly rasp, the words disjointed fragments of some other life. He mentioned names, Marcus, Sergeant, and places that meant nothing to her, Black Creek, the siege. Once his eyes, a startlingly pale gray, clear as a winter sky, focused on her. Water, he croaked, his voice like stones grinding together. Her heart leaped into her throat, but she held a cup to his split lips, and he drank greedily, his big, calloused hand surprisingly gentle as it steadied hers. Then his eyes clouded over again, and he slipped back into the fevered darkness. Alara existed in a state of suspended animation, her life revolving around the needs of the 2 males in her care. She tended the fire, doled out their meager rations of broth and dried apples, and constantly checked the stranger's wound. She changed his bandages twice a day, cleaning the angry-looking flesh with more of her mother's herbal wash. The fever held steady, a dry, burning heat that radiated from his skin. She feared it would consume him, but she did all she knew how to do. She brewed a tea from the willow bark to fight the inflammation and bathed his face and neck with cool water, trying to coax the fire out of him. Finn, after his initial fear of the giant sleeping by the fire, grew curious. He would stand at a safe distance, his thumb in his mouth, and just watch. "Is he a bear, Mama?" he asked once, his voice a small whisper in the dim cabin. No, sweet boy, Alara whispered back, stroking his fine, blonde hair. He's just a man who was lost in the storm. Is he going to wake up? I hope so, she said, though a part of her was terrified of that very possibility. The unconscious giant was a problem. The waking one could be a threat. On the third morning, the wind finally died down. The sudden, profound silence was more jarring than the constant noise had been. Alara woke from a light, uneasy doze in the rocking chair to find the pale gray eyes of the stranger fixed on her. He was awake, and he was lucid. There was no feverish haze in his gaze now, only a sharp, assessing intelligence. He didn't move a muscle, simply watched her, his expression unreadable. He looked like an apex predator that had just woken up in a trap, calmly evaluating his surroundings before deciding to tear it apart. Alara's breath caught in her throat. The iron poker was on the hearth, a whole room's length away. She sat frozen, her hands clutching the arms of the rocking chair. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. He took in the small cabin with a slow sweep of his eyes. The sparsely stocked shelves, the sleeping child in the corner, the threadbare curtains on the single window, and finally, her. His gaze lingered on her face, noting the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the worn fabric of her dress. "Where am I?" he finally asked. His voice was deeper than she remembered, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It was not the voice of a man accustomed to making small talk. "My cabin," she replied, her own voice thin and reedy. "On Whisperwind Ridge. You were caught in the blizzard. I found you outside." He pushed himself up onto one elbow, a wince of pain tightening the lines around his eyes. He looked down at the clean, tight bandage around his torso. "You pulled the bullet." It wasn't a question, it was a statement. He had the air of a man who understood wounds. "It would have festered," she said simply. He grunted, a sound that could have been agreement or dismissal. He swung his legs over the side of the makeshift bed and sat up, his bare feet flat on the cold floor. The quilt fell away, revealing a torso crisscrossed with old scars, a pale, jagged map of a violent life. He was even more imposing sitting up. He dwarfed the small space, his presence a raw, masculine force that was both terrifying and, to a part of her she had long thought dead, strangely compelling. "My thanks," he said, the words clipped and functional. He looked around again, his eyes landing on his rifle, which was still propped against the wall. A flicker of something, relief, maybe, passed through his eyes. "I didn't know if you were friendly," Alara admitted, the words tumbling out. "I didn't want to take any chances." His gaze returned to her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than cold assessment in his eyes. It might have been grim amusement. "Smart," he allowed. "Most folks would have either left me to freeze or stolen my rifle and left me to bleed out." The tension in the room eased, but only by a fraction. He was still a wild thing, an unknown quantity. He tried to stand, but a sharp intake of breath and the sudden pallor of his skin showed the effort was too much. He sank back down, his jaw tight with frustration. "You need to rest," Alara said, finding her footing. "You lost a lot of blood. You had a fever for 2 days." He didn't argue, which surprised her. He simply nodded, his eyes closing for a moment as a wave of dizziness passed. When he opened them again, his gaze fell on the nearly empty woodpile beside the hearth. He looked at it, then at the snow-blocked window, then back at her. He didn't say a word, but the question was clear. They were trapped, and they were running out of fuel. The cold would kill them just as surely as the storm. This was the moment, the pivotal act that would change everything. Without a word, he began to pull on his stiff, half-dry boots. "What are you doing?" Alara asked, alarmed. "You can't go out there. You'll tear your wound open." He ignored her, his movements slow but deliberate. He stood, swaying slightly, and braced a hand against the wall. He took a deep breath, his face a mask of pained concentration, and then he walked, stiff-legged, to the door. He lifted the heavy bar, his arm trembling with the effort. "Please," she begged, rushing to his side. "You'll kill yourself." He turned his head and looked down at her. They were standing so close she could see the flecks of darker gray in his irises. He smelled of wood smoke, fever, and a clean, wild scent like cold stone and pine needles. "The fire goes out, we all die," he said, his voice a low growl. It was the simple, brutal logic of survival. Before she could protest further, He opened the door. A wall of snow, packed solid and as high as his chest, greeted them. The world outside was a pristine, silent expanse of white under a sky the color of bruised iron. It was beautiful and deadly. The man didn't hesitate. He put his shoulder to the snow and pushed, grunting with the strain. The packed drift gave way with a soft whoosh, and he stumbled out into the cold. Alara watched in horrified disbelief as he waded through the waist-deep snow toward a small stand of dead pines about 50 yards from the cabin. He moved with a painful, limping gait, but he didn't stop. He reached the trees, braced himself against one, and began to systematically break off the dry, dead lower branches. He worked with a grim, focused economy of motion, snapping the wood with his bare hands and dropping it into a pile. When he had a load almost too big to carry, he gathered it in his powerful arms, his face pale and slick with sweat despite the biting cold. The journey back was agonizing to watch. He stumbled twice, nearly disappearing into the deep snow, but each time he fought his way back up, his jaw set like granite. He refused to drop a single branch. When he finally reached the doorway, he all but collapsed inside, dropping the huge load of firewood onto the floor with a clatter. He leaned against the doorframe, panting, his chest heaving. A fresh spot of red had begun to bloom on his bandage. He had risked his life, reopened his wound, all for a pile of firewood. For her son. He hadn't asked. He hadn't said a word. He had simply seen a need and met it, with no thought for his own well-being. It was a gesture of such profound, nonverbal kindness that it shattered the wall of fear she had built around her heart. This man wasn't a monster. He was a protector. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden. She rushed forward, not with fear, but with a desperate concern. "You fool," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You absolute fool." She helped him stumble back to his spot by the fire, her small frame supporting his immense weight. He sank down, his body trembling with exhaustion and pain. She immediately went to work, peeling back the bandage to check the damage. The wound was weeping again, but the stitches she hadn't realized he had put in himself at some point hadn't torn. It was a clean tear of the surface flesh. She cleaned it again, her touch infinitely more gentle than before. He watched her, his expression guarded, but he didn't pull away. When she was done, she ladled a bowl of the thin rabbit broth she'd made the day before. She handed it to him. Their fingers brushed, and a jolt, warm and startling, shot up her arm. He took the bowl, his gaze holding hers for a long moment. In his eyes, she saw a flicker of surprise, a dawning awareness that mirrored her own. He drank the soup in silence. Finn, now awake, crept out from his blankets and stood staring at the man, his fear finally overcome by a child's boundless curiosity. The man looked at Finn, and the harsh lines of his face softened almost imperceptibly. He reached into the pocket of his discarded trousers, which lay folded nearby, and pulled out the small, carved wooden bird. He held it out to Finn on his open palm. Finn looked at his mother for permission. Alara nodded, her throat tight. The boy scampered forward and gently took the bird from the man's huge hand. He stared at it in awe, his small fingers tracing the smooth, worn wood. "Thank you," Finn whispered, his voice barely audible. The man just nodded, his pale eyes watching the boy. In that single, quiet moment, the dynamic in the cabin shifted forever. He was no longer a stranger, a threat, or a burden. He was Kalen, though she didn't yet know his name. He was the man who had brought in the firewood. He was the man who had given her son a gift. And for the first time in a very long time, Alara felt a sliver of something she had thought was lost to her forever: hope. The days that followed the breaking of the blizzard fell into a quiet, domestic rhythm. The world outside remained a frozen, silent wilderness, but inside the small cabin, a fragile sense of peace began to take root. The man, who eventually introduced himself with the single, clipped word Kalen, recovered with the same stubborn, silent determination with which he did everything else. He spent most of his time resting by the fire, his imposing frame seeming to soak up the heat. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a constant, comforting weight in the small space. Alara found herself watching him, fascinated by the contrast between his savage appearance and his quiet, contained nature. He moved with a surprising economy of grace, a latent power in every line of his body. He would spend hours sharpening his knife on his whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone a soothing, meditative sound. Or he would stare into the flames, his face a stoic mask, his thoughts 1,000 miles away in the past he never spoke of. Alara wondered about the scars, about the names he'd muttered in his fever, about the man he had been before he became this solitary wanderer of the peaks. The gentle act of bringing in the wood had been a turning point, but the true foundation of their trust was built in the quiet moments that followed. It was built when Kaelin, seeing her struggle to split the larger logs with a dull axe, took the tool from her hands. Without a word, he spent a full hour sharpening the blade on his stone until it was razor-keen. Then, with a few economical, powerful swings, he split the entire pile, creating a neat stack of firewood that would last them a week. He didn't do it with any sense of showmanship, but with a simple, practical efficiency that was its own form of kindness. It was built when Finn, emboldened by the gift of the wooden bird, started to orbit closer to the silent giant. The boy would sit on the floor near him, chattering away about the pictures in his one tattered book or the shapes he saw in the fire. Kaelin would listen, his expression unreadable, occasionally offering a low grunt in response. One afternoon, Kaelin picked up a fresh piece of kindling and, with his newly sharpened knife, began to carve. Alara watched from the corner of her eye as a small, intricate shape began to emerge from the wood. Over the course of an hour, he carved a perfect, tiny wolf, its head thrown back in a silent howl. He held it out to Finn, who took it with wide, reverent eyes, adding it to his collection of one. From that moment on, Finn was his shadow, and the bond between the wounded giant and the small boy became a quiet, unshakable fact of their new reality. The true intimacy, however, came one evening after Finn had fallen asleep. The cabin was lit only by the soft, flickering glow of the fire. The silence was comfortable now, not tense. Alara sat in her rocking chair, mending a tear in Finn's small shirt, her fingers working automatically. Kaelin was staring into the fire, the flames dancing in his pale eyes. "Silas Croft," he said suddenly, his voice a low rumble that startled her. "The man you're afraid of. Tell me about him." It wasn't a demand, but a quiet invitation. And for some reason, Alara found herself wanting to tell him. Perhaps it was the safety of the firelit cabin, the storm-locked world outside, or the simple fact that someone was finally asking. The words, dammed up for so long, began to pour out of her. She told him everything. She told him about Liam, about his goodness, his laughter, and the way he'd always made her feel safe. She described their dream of building a life on this ridge, far from the grasping politics of the town. She spoke of the loan from Croft's bank, a small sum to buy seed and tools, a loan that had seemed so manageable at the time. Then she told him about Liam's accident, the official report that made no sense, the way Croft's men had been the ones to find the body. Her voice grew thick as she described the whispers that started afterward, the talk of her being a curse, a black widow. "It was him," she whispered, the confession raw and painful. "Croft started the rumors. I know he did. He wanted people to be afraid of me, to leave me isolated. He visited a week after the funeral. He didn't offer condolences. He offered marriage." She shuddered, the memory making her skin crawl. "He said he would forgive Liam's debt, that he would take me and Finn in and protect us. When I refused, he just smiled. A cold, thin smile. He said he was a patient man. He said the mountain winter was long and hard, and that eventually, I'd see things his way." She described the slow, methodical tightening of the noose. The general store in Havens Creek suddenly refusing her credit. The trappers who used to trade with her for her knitted goods and herbal remedies suddenly finding reasons to avoid her ridge. The way Croft's men would ride the perimeter of her land, just watching, a constant, silent threat. She was being starved out, frozen out, and terrorized into submission. She was a lone doe being circled by a patient pack of wolves, and she knew it. When she finished, tears were tracking silently down her cheeks. She hadn't realized she was crying. She felt exposed, vulnerable, having laid the whole pathetic, desperate story at his feet. She expected pity, or perhaps dismissal. Instead, Kaelin was silent for a long time, his jaw tight, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the hearthstone. The firelight carved deep shadows into his face, making him look like a vengeful granite idol. My father, he said, his voice rougher than before, was a man like that. Not a banker, a cavalry colonel. He believed the world was his to take, and that people were just tools or obstacles. He had a man under his command, a good man named Marcus, who spoke out against him, reported him for selling army supplies to bandits. 2 weeks later, Marcus was found dead. A training accident. The colonel offered my mother his condolences and a promotion for me if I kept my mouth shut. The story hung in the air between them, a stark and brutal parallel to her own. Alara stared at him, seeing the old scars on his face in a new light. They weren't just marks of battle. They were a record of his rebellion. What did you do? She whispered. A muscle jumped in his jaw. I didn't keep my mouth shut, he said, his voice flat and cold. I told the inspector general everything. The colonel had powerful friends. The report was buried. I was court-martialed on trumped-up charges. Cowardice in the face of the enemy. They broke my sword in front of the regiment. My father stood there and watched. He paused, his gaze lost in the flames. I spent 2 years in a military prison. When I got out, I never went back. I came to the mountains where a man's worth isn't measured by the friends he has in high places, but by whether he can survive the winter. In that moment, Alara understood him. He wasn't just a wild man who had rejected society. He was a man of honor who had been betrayed by a corrupt world, a world run by men like Silas Croft and his own father. He had retreated to a place where the rules were simpler, harsher, but infinitely more just. He was a man who understood injustice on a primal level. He understood what it was to be hunted, to be isolated, to have your name and your life stolen by a powerful, ruthless man. She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she gently placed it on his arm. His muscles were tense, hard as rock beneath her touch. He flinched, not like he was scared, but like he was used to being touched with gentleness. He looked from her hand to her face, his pale eyes searching hers. I'm so sorry, Kalen, she said softly. He just shook his head, a short, sharp gesture. But he didn't pull his arm away. They sat there in silence for a long time, her hand on his arm, the fire crackling in the hearth. It was a communion that went deeper than words. Two broken, solitary people who had found in each other a shared history of pain and a silent, profound understanding. In the heart of that frozen, isolated wilderness, they were no longer completely alone. A partnership had been forged in the crucible of shared trauma, a bond stronger than steel, tempered in the quiet firelight of a cabin besieged by winter. The thaw came slowly, then all at once. The world outside the cabin began to weep, water dripping from the eaves and running in small rivulets down the dirty window pane. The oppressive weight of the snow lessened, and a pale, watery sunlight filtered through the high clouds, bringing with it the scent of damp earth and melting ice. The end of their enforced isolation was near, and with it came a new, more immediate kind of dread. The blizzard had been a shield. Now, they were exposed. Kalen was almost fully healed. The wound was a puckered, angry scar on his side, but the fever was long gone, and his strength had returned. He moved around the cabin with a restless energy, his long confinement chafing at him. He spent hours staring out the window, his gaze fixed on the valley below, his expression grim. He was like a wolf scenting danger on the wind. Alara knew what he was thinking, because the same fear was a cold knot in her own stomach. Croft would be coming. The end of the storm was an invitation. The warning, when it came, was not from a friendly neighbor. None dared come near her land, but from Kalen's own sharp eyes. He was standing by the window, cleaning his long rifle with a practiced, methodical calm, when he suddenly went still. Riders, he said, his voice a low growl. Alara's heart seized. She rushed to his side, peering out the window. Far down the muddy track that served as a road to her property, she could see 3 figures on horseback. They were too far away to make out their faces, but she recognized the arrogant slump of the man in the lead. It was Jeb, Croft's primary enforcer, a man with cruel eyes and a perpetually sneering lip. They weren't riding hard. They were ambling, taking their time, an exploratory patrol to see if she had survived the storm. He's testing the waters, Kalen murmured, his eyes narrowed to slits. Seeing if the winter did his work for him, he watched as the riders came to the edge of her property line, marked by a crumbling stone wall. They stopped there, conferred for a moment, and then, to Alara's profound relief, they turned their horses and rode back toward town. "They're gone," she breathed, her knees feeling weak. "For now," Kalen corrected, his gaze not leaving the spot where they had disappeared. "That was a scout. The wolves are checking on the sheep. They'll be back, and they'll come in force." His words hung in the air, a death sentence. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. "What do we do? We can run. We can take Finn and go up into the mountains. You know the trails." Kalen turned from the window to face her. His expression was hard, resolute. "Run where? To starve in a cave? To be hunted like animals?" "No," he gestured around the small, sturdy cabin. "This is your home. This is defensible ground. We don't run. We fight." The word fight sounded alien and impossible. She was a healer, a mother. She knew how to mend, not how to break. "Fight? Kalen, I don't know how. They have guns. There will be more of them." "You'll learn," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. And with that, the fortification of the cabin began. The next 2 days were a blur of frantic, focused activity. Kalen was transformed. The quiet, contemplative man was gone, replaced by a ruthlessly efficient commander. He saw the world in terms of fields of fire, weak points, and strategic advantages. He directed Alara with short, clipped commands, and she obeyed without question, her fears sublimating into a fierce determination to survive. First, he hardened the cabin itself. He had her help him drag the heavy wooden table and wedge it against the door, reinforcing the bar. He used nails pulled from an old crate to secure the single window's shutters from the inside, leaving only a small crack to see and shoot through. He inspected the chinking between the logs, stuffing any gaps with mud and moss to prevent a stray bullet from finding its way through. The cabin, once her home, was becoming a fortress, a crude but effective pillbox. He took stock of their arsenal. His own long rifle, a powerful and accurate weapon. His heavy revolver. His knife. And Liam's old hunting rifle, a single-shot Springfield that had been gathering dust in the corner. He laid the Springfield on the table and began to clean it with the same meticulous care he gave his own weapons. He oiled the action until it was smooth and checked the barrel for any imperfections. When he was satisfied, he turned to Alara. "You know how to use this?" he asked. She shook her head, her eyes wide. "Liam tried to show me once. I didn't like it. The noise, the kick." "You'll like it more than what Croft's men have planned for you," he said bluntly. "Come on." He took her outside, to the back of the cabin where they were shielded from the view of the valley road. He propped a piece of firewood against a stump about 40 yards away. He handed her the rifle. It was heavy and awkward in her arms, a cold, alien thing of wood and steel. "Stance," he commanded. "Feet shoulder-width apart. Lean into it. If you lean back, it will knock you on your ass." He physically adjusted her, his large hands on her shoulders and back, positioning her body. His touch was impersonal, the touch of an instructor, but the warmth of his hands through her thin dress sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "The stock goes here," he said, pressing the wooden butt of the rifle firmly into the soft part of her shoulder. "Hold it tight. Let your body take the recoil." He showed her how to load the single, heavy cartridge, how to cock the hammer, how to line up the simple iron sights on the target. "Breathe out half a breath and hold it," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. "Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. Squeeze it like you're squeezing water from a sponge." Her heart was hammering. Her hands were sweating. She lined up the sights, the small piece of wood wavering in her vision. She took a breath, let half of it out, and squeezed. The explosion was deafening, a violent crack that echoed off the mountainside. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, a brutal, jarring punch that made her cry out and stumble backward. Kalen caught her, his strong arm steadying her. "Did I hit it?" she asked, her shoulder throbbing, her ears ringing. He looked downrange. The piece of wood was untouched. "No," he said, without judgment. Again, they spent the next hour like that. He was a patient, demanding teacher. He made her load and fire, over and over again. Her shoulder ached and was already turning a dark shade of purple. The smell of gunpowder filled her nostrils. She missed 5 times in a row, her frustration mounting with each shot. She was ready to give up, to throw the hateful thing down and tell him it was no use. "You're closing your eyes when you pull the trigger," he said calmly. You're anticipating the kick. Don't. Watch the target. Watch it until the rifle fires. He reloaded the gun and handed it back to her. This isn't a game, Elara. This is for Finn. Now again. His words, the mention of her son, cut through her frustration and centered her. He was right. This wasn't about her dislike of loud noises. This was about keeping her child alive. She took the rifle, her jaw set. She planted her feet, leaned into the stance, and brought the stock to her bruised shoulder. She ignored the ache. She lined up the sights on the distant piece of wood. She took a breath, let it out, and held. She stared at the target, forcing her eyes to stay open. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked, the sound just as loud, the kick just as hard. But this time she saw it. A puff of splintered wood erupted from the target as the heavy lead ball slammed into it, knocking it off the stump. She had hit it. A fierce, unfamiliar surge of triumph shot through her. She lowered the rifle, her arms trembling, and looked at Kalen. A rare, small smile touched the corners of his mouth. It transformed his harsh face, making him look younger, almost handsome. Good, he said. The single word of praise was worth more to her than 1,000 flowery compliments. Now again. They practiced until the sun began to dip behind the western peaks, casting long, ominous shadows across the valley. By the end of it, Elara could load, fire, and hit the target 4 times out of 5. She was exhausted, her body ached, but she no longer felt like a helpless victim. She felt the cold, hard weight of the rifle in her hands and knew that she was no longer just a sheep waiting for the slaughter. She was a wolf, too. A wounded, desperate wolf, backed into a corner with her cub, and she would fight with the savage grace of a cornered grizzly. As darkness fell, they retreated into their fortress, the silence thick with anticipation. They had done all they could. Now, all that was left was to wait for the attack. The attack came with the dawn. Elara was jolted from a shallow, dreamless sleep by Kalen's hand on her shoulder. They're here, he whispered, his voice a low growl in the pre-dawn gloom. The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. She was instantly awake, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She looked over at Finn, who was still sleeping soundly, blissfully unaware. A wave of fierce, protective love washed over her, so potent it almost brought her to her knees. She would die 1,000 deaths before she let them touch him. Kalen was already at the shuttered window, peering through the narrow crack. Elara scrambled to her feet, her hands automatically reaching for the cold, heavy stock of the Springfield rifle. It felt different in her hands now, not an alien object, but an extension of her will. She moved to the other side of the cabin, taking up a position near a small knothole Kalen had pointed out, which gave her a clear, if limited, view of the path leading to the front door. How many? She whispered, her throat dry. 7, he replied without turning. Croft's not with them. He sent his dogs, he scanned the approaching party, his eyes missing nothing. Jeb's in the lead. The others are just hired guns. Drifters and scum. They're sloppy. Overconfident. Elara peered through her knothole. She could see them now, emerging from the misty woods like wraiths. 7 men on horseback, moving slowly, their rifles held loosely across their saddles. They looked relaxed, as if they were on their way to a Sunday picnic rather than a violent eviction. They thought this would be easy. They thought they were coming for a lone, terrified woman. They had no idea what was waiting for them. They'll try to talk first, Kalen murmured, his voice calm and steady, a rock in the sea of her fear. Try to scare you out. When that doesn't work, they'll get angry. They'll try the door. That's when we act. You have the front. I have the flank. Don't fire until I do. Understand? I understand, she said, her voice firmer than she expected. The riders halted about 30 yards from the cabin. Jeb, a burly man with a florid face and a cruel mouth, dismounted. He swaggered toward the cabin, a piece of paper in his hand. Elara, he bellowed, his voice laced with false bonhomie. Elara, girl, you in there? Silas Croft sent me. He's a patient man, but his patience has run out. We have a legal writ of eviction here. You and the boy have 1 hour to gather your things and vacate the premises. Silence. The only answer was the drip of melting snow from the roof. Jeb's face darkened. The mask of civility was already slipping. Don't be a fool, woman. There's 7 of us here. You can't hold out. Come out now. and Mr. Croft might still be inclined to be generous. You defy him, and I can't guarantee your safety. Or the boys. The threat, so casually delivered, sent a spike of pure, white-hot rage through Alara. She gripped her rifle tighter, her knuckles white. She wanted to scream at him, to fire through the door and wipe the sneer off his face. But Kalen's voice, low and calm, cut through her anger. "Wait," he breathed. Outside, Jeb was losing his temper. He spat on the ground. "Fine. Have it your way, you cursed bitch. We'll come in and drag you out." He turned to his men. "Couple of you boys, take the door down." Two of the henchmen dismounted, grinning. They were carrying a thick log between them, a makeshift battering ram. This was the moment. "Now," Kalen said. He didn't fire from the window. In a move of startling speed, he unbarred the cabin's back door, a smaller, little-used exit that led to the woodpile. He slipped out into the gray morning light like a ghost, his big frame moving with a silent, deadly grace. Alara's heart leaped into her throat. He was outside. He was exposing himself. The two men with the ram took a running start at the front door. 1, 2, 3, they shouted. The log slammed into the door with a tremendous crash that shook the entire cabin. The wood groaned and splintered, but the heavy table and the bar held. Again, Jeb roared. As they backed up for a second run, a single, deafening shot cracked from the side of the cabin. It was the deep, powerful boom of Kalen's rifle. One of the men with the log grunted, dropped his end, and crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. The other man stared at his fallen partner in disbelief for a split second before another shot rang out. This one came from the front of the cabin. Alara, her sights fixed on the second man, had fired without conscious thought. The recoil was a familiar punch, but her eyes stayed open. She saw the man stagger back, clutching his leg, and fall screaming into the mud. She had done it. She had shot a man. There was no triumph, only a cold, grim finality. The remaining 4 henchmen, shocked out of their complacency, scrambled for cover, diving from their horses and firing wildly at the cabin. Bullets thudded into the log walls, sending splinters flying. One smashed through the window, showering the interior with glass. Finn, woken by the noise, began to cry, a high, terrified wail. "Stay down, Finn," Alara screamed, her voice raw with terror and adrenaline. She reloaded her rifle, her hands moving with a clumsy speed born of desperation. Kalen was a phantom in the trees. He fired again, and another man, who had been trying to circle around the side, pitched forward into the snow and lay still. "Free down." Jeb and the other 3 were now pinned down behind their horses and a large boulder. "He's in the trees." On the left, Jeb screamed, his voice high with panic. They directed their fire toward the woodline, bullets shredding bark and kicking up dirt around Kalen's last known position. But he was already gone, melting back into the shadows, using the terrain with the instinct of an animal. A bullet smashed through the wall near Alara's head, and she flinched back, her ears ringing. They knew her position now. She had to move. She scrambled across the floor, staying low, and took up a new spot near the hearth. The cabin was filling with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the dust of splintered wood. It felt like the whole world was coming apart. Suddenly, a new sound, the crackle of flames. One of the henchmen had managed to crawl close enough to throw a lit torch onto the cabin's dry, moss-covered roof. Smoke began to curl from the eaves. They were trying to burn them out. "The roof is on fire," Alara yelled, her voice cracking with despair. Kalen's voice came from outside, impossibly calm. "Keep their heads down." He was giving her an order. He was trusting her. The thought steadied her. She moved back to a window, peered out, and saw a man trying to reload his rifle behind a horse. She aimed, squeezed the trigger, and the horse screamed and fell as the bullet struck it. The man was exposed. Before he could react, Kalen's rifle boomed from a new position, and the man fell. For down. The siege was turning into a slaughter. The hired guns were no match for Kalen's lethal efficiency and Alara's desperate defense of her home. Jeb and the last 2 men were terrified. This wasn't what they had signed up for. "To hell with this," one of them shouted, scrambling to his feet. "Croft ain't paying me enough to die." He made a run for the woods, but he didn't get 10 feet before Kalen's rifle spoke one last time. 5. Now it was just Jeb and one other man, who was huddled behind the boulder, weeping with terror. Jeb was made of slightly sterner, or perhaps just stupider, stuff. He saw the flames licking up the side of the roof, smelled the smoke. He knew it was his only chance. "Burn! You bastards! Burn!" he shrieked, firing his pistol wildly at the cabin. Then, the front door, weakened by the battering ram, finally gave way with a splintering crash. The table slid back, and the door swung inward, hanging from one hinge. And in the doorway, framed by smoke and flame, stood Jeb. He had a crazed look in his eyes, his pistol raised. He saw Alara across the room, fumbling to reload her single-shot rifle. He saw Finn, cowering behind her, his small face streaked with tears. A triumphant, evil grin spread across Jeb's face. He had her. He took a step inside, leveling his pistol at her. "It's over, widow," he sneered. But it wasn't. From the shadows near the hearth, a huge shape lunged forward. Kalen, having slipped back inside while the men were distracted by the fire, moved with the savage grace of a cornered grizzly. He didn't use his rifle. He didn't use his gun. He closed the distance in 2 massive strides and slammed into Jeb like a landslide. The pistol went flying. Kalen's hands, huge and powerful, closed around Jeb's throat, lifting him clear off the floor. Jeb's eyes bulged, his face turned purple, and he made a series of horrible, gurgling sounds, his boots kicking uselessly at the air. But Kalen wasn't looking at Jeb. He was looking at Alara, and behind the cold fury in his eyes, she saw a question. This was her tormentor, her decision. Something inside Alara snapped. All the fear, the grief, the humiliation, coalesced into a single point of cold, hard rage. This man had threatened her child. He had tried to burn down her home. He was the face of all her suffering. She would not be a victim. Not anymore. She dropped the rifle. Her eyes darted around the room and fell on the iron fireplace poker, the one she had first carried out into the storm. She snatched it up. Its weight was familiar, righteous. She walked forward, her steps steady, and stood before the gasping, struggling man. "Get out of my house," she said, her voice low and deadly. And then she swung the poker with all the strength in her body, a vicious, clean arc that connected with the side of Jeb's head with a sickening crack. Kalen released him, and he dropped to the floor like a sack of grain, his eyes wide and vacant. A dark pool of blood began to spread from under his head. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the fire on the roof and Finn's terrified sobs. The last henchman, seeing his boss fall, threw down his gun and ran screaming into the woods, a flight of pure animal panic. It was over. Alara stood over Jeb's body, the poker still gripped in her hand, her chest heaving. She had done it. She had delivered the final blow. She looked up at Kalen, who was watching her, his face unreadable. He looked at the body, then at the poker in her hand, then at her face. He reached out and gently took the poker from her numb fingers, setting it on the table. Then his arms came around her, pulling her into a fierce, protective embrace. She buried her face in his chest, breathing in his scent of smoke and gunpowder and pine, and finally let the tremors take her. She had been through the crucible, and she had not been consumed. She had been reborn in fire. The aftermath of the battle was a scene of grim, chaotic work. The immediate threat was the fire. Kalen, moving with an urgency that belied the violence of the preceding hour, grabbed a bucket and began a frantic relay from the water barrel to the roof. Alara, her mind still reeling, shook herself from her stupor and joined him, her movements automatic. They worked as a team, a silent, efficient unit, scooping and throwing water onto the hungry flames that were eating away at the dry shingles of their home. The smoke was thick and choking, but they didn't stop until the last ember was extinguished, leaving a blackened, gaping hole in the roof, open to the gray sky. When the fire was out, they stood for a moment in the muddy, blood-soaked yard, surrounded by the quiet dead. The silence was profound, heavier than the blizzard's roar had ever been. The cost of their survival was laid bare around them. Alara looked at the still forms, their faces pale and empty in the morning light, and felt a wave of nausea. These were men who had woken up this morning expecting an easy day's work. Now they were just meat, cooling in the dirt. But then she looked at her cabin, violated but standing, and heard Finn's small, hiccuping sobs from inside, and the nausea was replaced by a hard, cold certainty. They had chosen this. They had forced her hand. "Finn," she said, her voice hoarse. She turned and ran back inside. Her son was huddled in the corner where she had left him, his face buried in his knees. She knelt and wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into a tight embrace. "It's okay, my love. It's over. We're safe." He clung to her, his small body trembling violently. She held him, rocking him gently, murmuring soft words of comfort, shielding his eyes from the terrible tableau outside and the still form of Jeb lying on the floor. Kalen dealt with the bodies. He did it with a grim, detached efficiency that spoke of long and unpleasant experience. He dragged them one by one to the edge of the woods, laying them side by side and covering them with a canvas tarp from their wagon. He did not spare a glance for their faces. They were no longer men. They were a problem to be dealt with. When he came back inside, he found Alara cleaning the blood from the floorboards. She was scrubbing with a furious energy, as if she could wash away the memory of the violence itself. "Leave it," he said, his voice gentle. "I'll take care of him." He meant Jeb. Alara nodded, unable to speak, and retreated to the corner with Finn, turning her son's face into her shoulder. She did not watch as Kalen wrapped the henchman's body in a blanket and carried him outside to join the others. When he returned, the cabin felt both emptier and safer. The last ghost had been exorcised. They spent the rest of the day patching their world back together. Kalen, with a woodsman's skill, cut and fitted new logs to patch the bullet holes. He temporarily repaired the broken door with planks from a crate and began the arduous process of cutting new shingles to repair the fire-damaged roof. Alara cooked, using the last of their provisions to make a thick, nourishing stew. The simple, domestic act was a comfort, a way of reclaiming their home from the violence that had desecrated it. They didn't talk about what had happened. There were no words for it. The shared experience was a raw, unspoken thing between them. He had seen the darkness in her, the capacity for violence she never knew she possessed, and he had not flinched. She had seen his brutal, lethal competence, and she was not afraid. They had fought together, bled together, and survived. Late that afternoon, a lone rider approached the cabin. Alara's hand flew to her rifle, but Kalen laid a calming hand on her arm. "It's all right," he said. "I know him. It was an old trapper named Jedediah, a grizzled man with a kind face who lived a solitary life in the mountains, much like Kalen. He was the one Kalen had mentioned trading with sometimes." He looked at the bodies under the tarp, at the splintered door and the burned roof, and then at Kalen, his expression grim. "Heard the gunfire all the way from my line," Jedediah said, his voice a gravelly drawl. "Figured it was Croft finally making his move. You folks all right?" "We're all right," Kalen said. "Counted 7 of 'em right up this morning," the old trapper said, his eyes going back to the tarp. "Looks like they found more trouble than they bargained for." He looked at Alara with a newfound respect. "The law from Silver Creek is on its way." The one that ran got to a logging camp, started babbling about a demon in the woods and a she-cat with a rifle. The foreman sent a boy to fetch Marshall Thompson. He's an honest man, not in Croft's pocket like the law in Havens Creek. The news was a profound relief. The arrival of an honest lawman meant they might have a chance to see justice done, to have their actions seen as the self-defense they were. Jedediah stayed for a bowl of stew, his quiet, friendly presence a balm after the day's horror. He promised to speak to the marshal on their behalf, to attest to Croft's long campaign of harassment. When he left, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a starkly beautiful backdrop to the day's ugliness. But as one crisis passed, another was already gathering on the horizon. A few days later, as Kalen was putting the finishing touches on the new roof, a wagon rattled up the path. It was the doctor from Silver Creek, a harried-looking man named Elias Vance. He wasn't there about the gunfight. He was there because word of Alara's skill with herbs, a story Jedediah had apparently shared, had reached him. "There's a sickness," Dr. Vance said, his face pale with exhaustion. "A fever. We're calling it the winter lung fever. It starts with a cough, then a deep ache in the bones, and then the lungs fill. People are dying. Fast. It's sweeping through the lower valleys, hitting Havens Creek the worst. I'm the only doctor for 50 miles, and I'm out of my depth. The usual remedies do nothing." He looked at Alara, his eyes pleading. Jedediah said your mother was a great healer. He said you have her knowledge. Is there anything you know? Any herb, any root from these mountains that might help? Alara thought of the stories her mother used to tell, of the old plagues and the mountain remedies that had fought them. She remembered one in particular, a story about a choking fever and a rare, deep-rooted plant that grew only in the shaded, high-altitude hollows. A plant called stonebreath root. There might be something, she said slowly. A poultice for the chest and a tea. It's supposed to clear the lungs. But the main ingredient, it's rare. It only grows high up, in places that are hard to reach. Before she could finish, Kalen spoke. He had been listening silently, his face grim. Show me what it looks like, he said to Alara. Describe the leaves, the flower. I will find it. And so, the new battle began. It was not a battle of bullets and blood, but of knowledge, endurance, and compassion. The very next day, people started to arrive. At first, it was just one desperate family from an outlying homestead, their youngest child burning with fever. Alara, her heart aching at the child's labored breathing, went to work. She brewed the teas from the herbs she had on hand. Willow bark for the fever, mullein for the cough, and mixed a poultice of mustard seed and crushed garlic to lay on the child's chest. She showed the mother how to do it, her voice calm and reassuring. Meanwhile, Kalen was gone. He had left before dawn with only a drawing of the stonebreath root she had made on a piece of bark and a promise. I'll be back, was all he'd said. He was heading deep into the high peaks, into the melting snows and treacherous terrain where the life-saving plant grew. The next day, 2 more families arrived. Then a wagon from Havens Creek itself, the very town that had scorned and cursed her. The people looked at her with a mixture of fear, shame, and desperate hope. They had heard the stories, the cursed widow on the ridge who held the only key to survival. Alara felt a flicker of bitter satisfaction, but it was quickly overwhelmed by the sight of their suffering. She saw not the faces of her tormentors, but the faces of desperate parents and frightened children. And so she helped them. She turned her cabin into a makeshift infirmary, her yard into a triage center. She worked tirelessly, her hands constantly busy measuring herbs, brewing teas, and mixing poultices. Finn, seeing his mother's work, helped in his own small way, carrying cups of water and fetching clean rags. Kalen returned after 2 days, haggard and exhausted, but triumphant. His satchel was full of the gnarled, dark roots of the stonebreath plant. He had climbed to elevations where the air was thin and cold, risking his life on treacherous ledges to find it. He handed the satchel to her, and their eyes met over it. In his gaze, she saw a profound respect, an awe that went deeper than anything she had seen before. He was not just her protector now. He was her partner in a war against death itself. With the stonebreath root, her remedies became truly potent. She showed the grateful families how to prepare it, how to boil the root into a dark, bitter tea that eased the congestion, and how to make a paste that, when applied to the chest, seemed to draw the fire from the lungs. Word of her success spread like wildfire. She was no longer the cursed widow. They started calling her the Saint of Whisperwind Ridge. Her yard was soon filled with the sick and the dying, a desperate camp of people from 3 counties. Kalen became her tireless supplier, making repeated, dangerous trips into the high country for more roots, and organizing the camp, his natural authority bringing order to the chaos. One evening, after a grueling day of tending to dozens of patients, Alara saw a familiar wagon pull up. It was Silas Croft. He was not there as a conqueror. He was slumped in the back of the wagon, his face gray, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. His driver, his face a mask of terror, looked at Alara. Please, ma'am, he begged. It's the fever. He's dying. Alara looked down at the man who had tried to destroy her, the man who had almost certainly murdered her husband. He was weak, pathetic, his wealth and power useless against the microscopic organism invading his lungs. All her anger, all her hatred, seemed to drain away, leaving only a vast, weary pity. She looked at Kalen, who stood beside her, his face like stone. He would do whatever she decided. She could let him die. It would be justice. But as she looked at his gasping, desperate face, she saw only another suffering human being. She was a healer. It was who she was. It was in her hands, in her heart. Bring him over by the fire, she said, her voice tired but clear. I'll see what I can do. As she turned to prepare another dose of the bitter tea, she knew that this act of mercy was her final victory over him. She would not let him turn her into a monster. She would save his life, and in doing so, she would save herself. The fever broke as spring finally claimed the mountains. The last of the snow melted from the high peaks, and the valley floor erupted in a riot of green shoots and wildflowers. The winter-lung fever, which had scythed through 3 counties, receded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a wake of grief, but also a profound sense of communal survival. The camp in Alara's yard slowly dispersed as families, weary but grateful, returned to their homes. They left behind gifts, a sack of flour, a bolt of cloth, a newly forged axe head, small tokens of an immeasurable debt. Alara's cabin, once a symbol of cursed isolation, had become a landmark of hope. Her name was spoken with reverence in the very towns that had once shunned her. Silas Croft had survived. Alara's remedies, administered with a detached professionalism that was more damning than any hatred, had pulled him back from the brink. He had left without a word of thanks, his face a mask of humiliation and disbelief. But his power was broken. Marshal Thompson, the honest lawman from Silver Creek, had conducted a thorough investigation into the attack on the cabin. With testimony from the captured henchman, the repentant driver, and old Jedediah, a clear picture of Croft's long campaign of terror emerged. The marshal also quietly reopened the investigation into Liam's death. Croft, weakened by illness and stripped of his allies, saw his empire of fear crumble. He sold his holdings for pennies on the dollar and disappeared, a disgraced tyrant fleeing the whispers that now followed him. The debt on Alara's land was declared null and void. She was, for the first time, truly free. A fragile peace settled over the ridge. The land was hers. Her son was safe. Her name was cleared. But as the world returned to a semblance of normalcy, a new, quiet tension grew in the small cabin. Kalen, the wild man of the mountain, the avenging angel, the tireless gatherer of roots, seemed out of place in this new domestic tranquility. The immediate threat was gone. The crisis was over. His purpose, it seemed, was fulfilled. Alara would watch him as he stood at the edge of the woods, his gaze fixed on the high, lonely peaks that had been his only home for years. He was like a wolf that had been kept by a fire too long, the call of the wild pulling at him. He had started to gather his few belongings, his spare furs, his whetstone, his tinderbox, and pack them methodically into his worn leather satchel. He did it slowly, over the course of several days, as if reluctant to complete the task, but the intention was clear. He was preparing to leave. The thought of it was a physical ache in Alara's chest, a cold dread that was worse than her fear of Croft had ever been. This quiet, scarred man had become the center of her world. He was the rock against which she had weathered the storm, the fire that had kept her warm, the partner who had stood beside her in battle and in healing. The thought of the cabin without his steady, silent presence was unbearable. The silence would no longer be peaceful, it would be empty. One bright, clear morning, she came outside to find him standing by the woodpile, his satchel and rifle slung over his shoulder. He was looking at the cabin, his face a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite decipher: longing, regret, and a deep, ingrained solitude. This was it. The crossroads. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. He turned to face her, his pale eyes full of a strange sadness. "The fever's gone," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Croft is gone. You're safe now. You and the boy." "And that's it?" she asked, a tremor in her voice she couldn't control. "Your duty is done, so you just walk away." He looked pained. "This is your life, Alara. Your home. You've earned it. You're a hero to these people. You belong here." He gestured vaguely toward the mountains. "I don't. My world is up there." Alone he believed it. He truly believed he was a creature of the wild, unfit for the warmth and complication of a home, a family. He thought his duty was to protect, and once the protection was no longer needed, his role was finished. "You think that's all you are to me?" she asked, her voice rising, thick with unshed tears and a growing anger. "A guard dog? A weapon to be put away when the fight is over?" He flinched as if she had struck him. "No, that's not." "Then what?" She stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "What were the last few months, Kalen? Just a means to an end? You fought for this place. You bled for it. You helped me save half the county. You taught my son how to carve a wolf. You sat by my fire and told me your secrets. Is that just nothing?" He had no answer. He just stood there, a mountain of a man looking utterly lost. He had faced down soldiers, assassins, and blizzards, but he was defenseless against this. She took another step until she was standing directly in front of him, her hands clenched at her sides. This was it. The final battle, the one that mattered most. "I am not the same woman you found in the storm, Kaelin. I am not a frightened widow waiting to be rescued. I know my own mind, and I know my own heart. And I am telling you that my home is not this cabin, not this land. Not without you." The words hung in the clean mountain air between them. It was a terrifying, exhilarating confession. She had laid her heart bare, offering it to this man who was so afraid of having one. "I am not asking you to stay because I need a protector," she continued, her voice softening into a plea. "I am asking you to stay because I need you. Because Finn needs you. We are your family, if you will have us. Your home is not up there in the cold and the silence anymore. It's here." She reached up and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. "It's here." He looked down at her hand, then into her eyes. She saw the war raging within him, the ingrained solitude of a lifetime battling against the dawning, terrifying possibility of belonging. He had built his walls so high to keep the corrupt world out, but in doing so, he had also kept out the light, the warmth, the love. She was asking him to tear them down. He slowly raised his own hand, his calloused, scarred fingers covering hers. His touch was warm, hesitant. He looked past her, at the cabin with its newly patched roof, at the curl of smoke rising from the chimney, at Finn, who was watching them from the doorway, his small face anxious. He saw the life that was being offered to him, not a life of battle and survival, but one of quiet mornings, shared meals, and a little boy who idolized him. A life with a woman who had seen the worst of him and loved him anyway. A long, shuddering breath escaped him, the breath of a man letting go of a burden he had carried for a lifetime. The hardness in his face dissolved, replaced by a raw vulnerability that stole her breath. "Alara," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. He didn't need to say anything else. He slid the satchel and the rifle from his shoulder, letting them fall to the ground with a soft thud. It was an act of surrender, a choice. He was laying down his arms, not in defeat, but in victory. He was choosing her. He was choosing home. His other hand came up to cup her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. He leaned down, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion or desperation, but of profound, breathtaking tenderness. It was a promise, a homecoming. It tasted of wood smoke, pine, and the hopeful, clean scent of spring. Months later, the land was vibrant with the full flush of summer. The blackened scar on the roof had been fully repaired, the new shingles weathering to a silvery gray that blended with the old. A small, thriving garden grew where the muddy, blood-soaked ground had been, its neat rows of beans, squash, and corn a testament to their shared labor. The cabin, once a fortress, was a home again, its door and windows open to the warm mountain breeze. Kaelin was a different man. The harsh, solitary edges of him had been softened by love and belonging, like a rugged stone smoothed by a persistent, gentle river. The haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet contentment. He still possessed his formidable strength and wild grace, but now it was channeled into building, not just surviving. He had added a new room onto the cabin for Finn, and was planning a small barn for the milk cow they hoped to buy before winter. He had not forgotten the mountains, but now he went to them not as a fugitive, but as a man who knew his way home. He would take Finn with him on short trips, teaching him how to read the tracks of deer and fox, how to find wild berries, and how to listen to the language of the forest. He would return in the evening with a string of fish or a brace of rabbits, his son perched triumphantly on his broad shoulders, and the sight would make Alara's heart ache with a quiet, perfect joy. One warm evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, painting the sky in fiery colors, Alara stood on the small porch Kaelin had built, watching him and Finn in the yard. Kaelin was showing the boy how to skip stones across a puddle left by an afternoon shower. Finn's laughter, bright and carefree, echoed in the twilight. Kaelin looked up and saw her watching, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. a smile she now knew as well as her own reflection. He walked toward her, lifting Finn into his arms and settling him on his hip. He came to a stop before her, his presence a warm, solid comfort. "He has your eyes," Kalen said, his voice a low, soft rumble. "He has your stubbornness," she countered, a playful light in her own eyes. She reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from Finn's forehead, her fingers then tangling with Kalen's where his hand rested on the boy's back. It was a small, unconscious gesture of a family, a unit, a whole. Kalen leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, Finn nestled safely between them. "I never knew," he whispered, his voice thick with wonder. "I never knew life could be like this." "Neither did I," she whispered back. They stood there for a long moment, a silent trinity against the backdrop of the setting sun and the vast, peaceful mountains. He was the noble savage, the gentle giant, who had found his purpose not in solitude, but in the fierce, tender bonds of family. And she was the resurrected phoenix, the woman who had risen from the ashes of grief and persecution, not just a survivor, but a healer, a fighter, a wife, and a mother, made whole by the trials she had endured. He shifted Finn to his other hip, freeing a hand to cup her face, and kissed her deeply, a kiss of lasting peace and endless promise. Here, on their hard-won piece of earth, they had found their sanctuary. This was a story about how the deepest wounds can be healed, not by forgetting the past, but by building a future. It was about a woman called Cursed who found her true calling in her own healing hands, and a man who lived like a beast who discovered his humanity in the arms of a family. They were two broken souls from opposite worlds, one from the heart of a community that betrayed her, the other from the desolate wilderness he chose over betrayal. Trapped by a storm, they found a common enemy, and in fighting together, they found a common love. Their journey shows us that true strength isn't about standing alone against the world, but about finding the one person worth standing with, turning a lonely shelter into a loving home, and proving that even in the harshest winter, the most resilient hope can and will take root.